The first moment that I've picked out, though, where we get a key moment where he begins to lose it and lose that sense of control, is what I call his dramatic change of state. And this came after about 6 minutes, so it wasn't long before this happened. His body language mood of regal authority and superiority changes dramatically. We get a wariness in his eye expression and almost a look of fear. And it's almost specifically at the point where Emily uses a more legal sounding phrase. So this is not going to be a suck-up interview. She uses the phrase "just for the record."
Just for the record, you've been on his private plane.
Yes.
You've been to stay on his private island.
Yes.
And it's almost as though that alerts Andrew, because that's when she starts to pin him down on specific dates. She mentions a date in 2006 in May, and then we get a very strong reaction from Andrew, where his composure seems to break. His eyes narrow initially in wariness, but then suddenly they roll dramatically in what looks like performed surprise or almost exasperation. Why are we going into this level of detail?
So in 2006, in May,
Emily mentions Epstein's arrest warrant for sexual assault. And that's the point where suddenly Andrew's head tilts back, so he loses that look of authority. It's almost as though he's been punched from the words.
An arrest warrant was issued for Epstein for sexual assault of a minor.
Yes.
In July.
And this is where we begin to get a display of barrier rituals that hint at self-protection. He lifts his hand to his face, he places his finger across his chin, he starts to rub it in a slight act of that sort of trying for self-control. And we get a classic tongue poke gesture from him. And that's usually seen as a gesture of rejection or disgust. My second moment is what I call his overkill marketing moment. So, not content with giving a series of non-waterproof excuses as to why he was meeting up with Epstein, Andrew goes further, and again, this is where I felt the arrogance came across. He pushes credulity to the limits when his overall excuses for time spent with Epstein after his conviction include showing what he calls leadership.
I took the decision that I had to show leadership, and I had to go and see him, and I had to tell him, that's it.
I was being a leader. And the disingenuous, my tendency to be too honourable. Now, not only does he attempt to take back control in the interview, and this is after about 11 minutes, by using his index finger, we get this finger coming out like a baton, as though he's trying to conduct the action at that point. But he then moves into an expression of ironic humour, which he seems to think is self-effacing, maybe slightly adorable. His sigh of exasperation at being asked why he stayed at the home of a convicted sex offender turns into slowly a slightly artful facial expression. As he screws his features up, he kind of winces with one eye as though he's sending out a tie sign to Emily.
You were invited to that dinner as a guest of honour.
I don't think it was quite as you might put it, but yeah, okay, I was there at dinner, yeah.
And he performs a head and brow shrug before he puckers his brows, and his lips form an almost smug-looking smile of inner amusement, sort of, well, you won't believe this, but he turns his too honourable line into a mock question for Emily. I'm just too honourable. You know, you see this, don't you? And a deep frowning stare at her at this revealed weakness in inverted commas.
Judgment was probably coloured by my tendency to be too honourable.
Someone maybe should have warned him to never take an audience for fools, but he clearly at this point felt compelled to twist negative behaviour that he was being accused of into what he was overselling a bit like a job interview where you say, well, what's your worst trait? Oh, I tend to be too early for things and I'm too punk. It's too much of a twist. My third key point, I've called it his dog ate my homework excuses. Andrew is at his body language weakest when he shows signs of feeling that he's being smart and confident while looking almost slightly cunning. His "I don't sweat" excuse showed off his total lack of ability to read the room.
I have a peculiar medical condition, which is that I don't sweat.
His projectile laugh, when he starts to go into this phase that he's obviously already planned in his head, announces his mockery of the claim that he was sweating in Tramp nightclub. And he holds his hand up in a gesture of rebooted control at this point and actually interrupts Emily.
She described dancing with you and you profusely sweating, and that she went on to have bath, possibly.
There's a slight problem.
So that he can make this point, so he can go into what is essentially one of the most awkward moments of the interview. He starts to use what are called precision gestures with his fingers, a finger pinch and a measuring gesture. And this is to imply precise thought for this point. And his brows pucker rather dramatically. As he clumsily reminds Emily and the viewers of his hero status against overselling, pushing it a little bit too far. It's almost a "do you know who I am? Do you remember who I am" moment. His brows steeple as he fixes her with a hard stare. His finger points as though he's writing in the air, but his body language at this particular point becomes incongruent. So we also see his hand curling into a fist. And as much as he's trying to write his messages in the air with his finger, we see a marked increase of anxiety rituals, like eye stutters. He begins to blink very quickly. Eye cut off. Sometimes he closes his eyes in a long blink. We suddenly get a lot of verbal fillers, so not concise speech. A lot of stammering at this point.
I'm afraid to say that there's a medical condition that says that I didn't do it, so therefore. And
verbal self-corrections where he starts to correct his own words. These all look and sound like what's called self-heckling here, as though he's putting his verbal and non-verbal messages into apparent conflict.